In the endless silence of the void, there is a peace unlike any known upon worlds of stone and soil. It is the stillness of infinity, where stars drift like frozen embers scattered across an ocean of black. No wind stirs here, no rain falls, and no sound carries across the abyss. It is a silence that feels eternal, absolute, and yet it is never truly empty. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and yet to speak it aloud so plainly would be too harsh, too sudden. So instead, imagine the galaxy as a vast tapestry, woven not from threads of silk, but from blood, steel, and secrets. Its weave is imperfect, frayed at the edges, scarred where the needles of time have bitten too deep. At first glance, from a distance, it is beautiful. The stars burn bright, nebulae swirl in hues of violet and gold, and ancient worlds spin in their endless dance. But as one steps closer, as the hand lingers upon the fabric, one feels the flaws, the scars, the stains that can never be washed clean. This is where the tale begins. The Imperium of man, a realm spanning 1,000,000 worlds, stands eternal, or so it claims. Its worlds are bound by faith, by steel, and by the will of a god-emperor who sits upon a throne of unyielding machinery, neither living nor dead. The people of this empire live and die in his name, their voices raised in prayer that echoes across the stars. And yet in every corner of that vast dominion there are shadows, some born from ignorance, some from rebellion, and some from the sins too carefully hidden to ever be confessed. Tonight, it is not the Imperium as a whole that concerns us. It is one legion, one brotherhood, one order of warriors who carry a burden heavier than most. They are the first legion of the Emperor's angels of death. They are the Dark Angels. At first, to hear their name is to feel reassured. Angels, after all, are protectors. They are the Emperor's chosen, armored in ceramite and faith, wielding bolters that roar like thunder. In the darkness, they are meant to be a light, but light can cast shadows, and in those shadows, truths are buried. The First Legion knows this well, for they carry a sin so great, so terrible, that it must never be spoken aloud. Listen closely, and I will tell you their tale, not in the voices of scholars, nor in the grand proclamations of the Imperium, but as a whisper carried on the wind. A story meant not for triumph, but for unease. For the Dark Angels are not only warriors, they are keepers of secrets, and secrets, when buried, do not stay silent forever. Picture now a world long forgotten by imperial cartographers. It does not shine upon any star map. It is lost, like so many, swallowed by the endless churn of time and war. But once long ago, it was named Caliban. Caliban was a dark world, swathed in endless forests where titanic beasts stalked beneath a canopy that blotted out the stars. It was a place of knights and castles, of oaths sworn beneath storm-darkened skies, and of monsters that haunted the dreams of its people. It was upon this world that a child came to be, a child who would grow into something far more than mortal men. His name was Lion Eljansen, the Primarch of the Dark Angels. But do not let the tale of a hero's birth lull you into comfort, for even in childhood, the lion was touched by solitude. Raised among shadows and monsters, he learned to fight before he learned to speak. He learned silence before he learned trust. And though he would rise to command legions of warriors, a part of that isolation never left him. It lingered deep within, like a splinter lodged too close to the heart to ever be removed. The Dark Angels mirrored their father in this way. Warriors of silence, warriors of secrets, warriors who knew that even as they brought the Emperor's light to the galaxy, there were places where the shadows would never fully retreat. At first, when you hear their story, it may feel grand. Knights of the future, angels of iron, marching into the stars to bring unity to a fractured humanity. Their armor gleamed dark green, their banners bore the sigils of the winged sword, and their bolters thundered in the Emperor's name. They were unstoppable, they were eternal, they were pure. But purity is a fragile thing. It takes only one fracture, one whisper for it to shatter. And once shattered, it can never be made whole again. Close your eyes and imagine standing among them. The chill of the void seeps through even the thick walls of the warship. The air tastes of machine oil and recycled breath. The hum of plasma reactors thrums beneath your feet, like a heartbeat too vast to belong to any single creature. And then there are the warriors themselves, the Dark Angels. They move like giants, each step heavy enough to make the deck plates tremble. Their armor groans as it shifts, the servos whining softly, the seals hissing with every movement. You look into their eyes, or rather into the cold lenses of their helms, and see nothing reflected back. No warmth, no humanity, only duty, only silence. To stand among them is to feel small, as though you have been weighed and measured and found wanting. Yet if you listen carefully, you may notice something else. A whisper, faint, like the sigh of wind through an ancient forest. It is not a sound of comfort. It is a sound that lingers, that makes the hairs upon your neck rise. For though the Dark Angels march as one, within them lies division. Within them lies the memory of betrayal. They do not speak of it. They would rather die than confess it. But it is there, as constant as the beat of their twin hearts. It follows them into battle. It haunts them in prayer. And in the still hours of the night, when the ship drifts through the void, some swear they can hear the whispers of the fallen. The fallen. You may not know the name, but you will come to. They were once brothers of the Dark Angels, clad in the same green armor, sworn to the same oaths. But when the great heresy of Horus tore the galaxy in two, the First Legion fractured. Some remained loyal to the Emperor, fighting with a ferocity that scorched entire worlds. Others turned, swayed by pride, by doubt, by whispered promises of power. They fell not only from grace, but from time itself, scattered across the galaxy, across ages, like shards of a broken mirror. And ever since, the Dark Angels have hunted them, relentlessly, secretly. For to reveal their existence would be to admit the truth, that the First Legion, the honored sons of the Emperor, were not pure. They were flawed. They were broken. And that sin must never be known. In the beginning, you may feel calm, lulled by the cadence of the tale. It feels like legend, like myth recited by firelight. But beneath it, even now, the unease stirs. Do you feel it? The weight of secrets pressing against the edges of truth. The silence that is not empty, but waiting. The shadows that cling even when the stars burn bright. This is the nature of the Dark Angels. To the galaxy, they are warriors of faith and duty. To themselves, they are hunters and prisoners of their own past, bound by loyalty, chained by guilt, never speaking, never confessing, but always remembering. And as this tale begins, as the first steps are taken into their history and their sins, you must ask yourself, what is heavier, the armor upon their shoulders or the burden they dare not name? There is a shape to every soul, even those that have been remade by ceramic and servos. Some shapes are broad and open, like plazas under sunlit skies. Some are narrow and folded in upon themselves, like corridors that lead always back to the same locked door. The Dark Angels are such corridors, long, echoing, and always guarded. To know them is to walk slowly down those lanes, to run a hand along walls worn smooth by oaths, and to feel the chill that comes when no candle burns. They are, above all else, a people of reticence. They speak through actions, not words. They mark their sins upon their armor and hide their shame behind ritual. When you look at a Dark Angel up close, you see more than paint and sigil. You see centuries of repetition. You see cycles of preparation, prayer, oiling, the whispered rites that make a warrior whole again after battle. Their lives are measured in the pace of these repeated acts. Each movement is neat, controlled, and precise, as if the smallest disorder might unravel the whole. And in this neatness is something that looks very like fear. Fear, for them, is not a thing admitted. It is a mechanic, a tool to be used and then discarded. It is the tightening of a gauntlet before battle, the extra swing of a blade in training, the refusal to look too closely into the eyes of a brother who lingers too long on a memory. They have trained themselves into beings who can stand in the face of horrors that would make ordinary men howl. Yet the worst of those horrors has always been internal. The fear of discovery, the terror of a truth once known that cannot be unknown. To understand the Dark Angels, one must accept the paradox of their devotion. They are devout, faithful to the Emperor, to the Codex of War, to the austere discipline that keeps them whole. Their liturgies are beautiful in their austerity, hymns that are half metal, half chant, prayers muttered into the arc lamps of their chapels, the long exhalations of men who have made violence a sacrament. But that same devotion is a double-edged blade. Faith carved into bone can become a prison. When devotion becomes the map by which all things are judged, anything that falls outside can be judged as treachery. Thus was born their greatest obedience, secrecy. It is one thing to hold a fold of one's tabard closed against the wind. It is another to fold one's life inward and bolt the seam with oath and iron. The Dark Angels sealed their shame into compartments, hidden archives deep within their fortress monasteries, whispered codes shared only in the breath between brothers, rituals conducted in the dead hours when the rest of the world slept. These secrets were not idle curiosities, they were the scaffolding of identity. Reveal one, and the whole order shivers. There are ranks and titles within their brotherhood that a casual eye might mistake for pomp. They are not. Each knot of title is a place of responsibility and pain. The inner circle, those who know more than others, are heavier than the rest not because of rank, but because they carry memory. They remember names that others have forgotten, names that unmake the comfortable stories the Legion tells itself. To sit among them is to feel the gravity of unspoken things, a weight that has nothing to do with ceramite or chainmail, but rests somewhere beneath the sternum, where conscience once lived. It is important here to speak of the rituals, for rituals are the language through which the Dark Angels translate themselves into being. A ritual begins with light and ends with a vow. Candles are not mere illumination, they are witnesses. Swords are not mere weapons, they are covenant. When a brother is unhooded, the sound is not simply the clank of metal. It is the pealing of time itself, a sound that speaks across ages. And in the dim light of the sanctum, where banners hang like frozen waves and incense clings to the stone, men confess to one another without speaking. They read the lines of scars, they note the tremor of a hand, they see what another will not say, and they respond with a look that carries both comfort and accusation. That look, the constant, almost clinical appraisal of one brother by another, has a chilling effect. It creates a climate where softness is punished because softness invites curiosity, and curiosity invites questions. Questions are dangerous for people who have bound themselves to secrecy. To answer one is to open a door that cannot be closed. The Dark Angels are austere in appearance and austere in soul. Their world is made of regimented colors, green as shadow, white as the sword's edge, bone as the memory of what they have lost. But within that ordered palette, there are ruptures, stains of guilt, marks of battle, the occasional bolt of red that signals a wound still fresh. They have adapted their bodies to the needs of war. What was once human has been wrapped in servo and ceramite. Yet beneath the plates, beneath the augmetics and the implants, there remain little things that are stubbornly, maddeningly human. The ache of loss, the crack of old laughter in a memory, the abrupt sting of grief when a brother does not return. It is in the quiet moments, when armor is stripped to be polished, when a Marine sits alone and allows his voice to break into a whispered lullaby, that you can almost find what remains of the man. The space between missions is when the human tends to leak out, ventures to the surface like oil finding a crack. They hum old songs in a tongue that the Mechanicum would never approve, and they touch the mouths of relics the way a child touches a beloved toy, with a gentle reverence that has nothing to do with doctrine. These are small rebellions, tiny proofs that the machine has not entirely consumed the man. Yet the very architecture of the Legion conspires to drown these rebellions. The life of a Dark Angel is an alternation of ritualized violence and ritualized silence. At dawn, they awaken with the sound of klaxons and the smell of burning synthoxin. They march to the armory as if to mass, collect their weapons, and become instruments of war. At dusk, they return to medici stations and chapels, where wounds are tended and confessions are processed through screens and chaplains. Even their grief is mediated, sanitized by liturgy so that sorrow becomes duty. There is an economy to their emotions. Nothing is allowed to expand beyond its allotted coin. Where other legions might have banners and open mourning, the dark angels bind themselves tighter. This is not just strategy, it is identity. It is how they have kept themselves together across millennia, by telling themselves that the only safe thing is to be impenetrable, to be an uncracked stone. But stones can fissure from pressure applied long and slowly, and that is the true danger they refuse to name. To see the nature of their faction is to see the anatomy of a people who chose to crown themselves with duty in place of compassion. Their glory is the quiet, terrible kind. Victories not announced with fanfare, but recorded in small ledgers of names. Names scratched into the inner plates of helmets. Names that must be remembered lest they become ghosts. And yet in the same ledger, in the very margins, there are other names, crossed out, or altered, or written in a language only the inner circle can read. These are the names of the fallen. They are the stains at the edge of a holy cloth. Who are the fallen, if not the mirror in which the dark angels refuse to look? Once brothers, once companions, these men diverged at the crucible of choice. Some were tempted by pride, others by despair. Some were seduced by forces they told themselves they could master. The reasons are many, but they all arrive at the same end: exile. The fallen do not merely leave, they unmake themselves. They scatter like seeds born on a storm, and in every place they land, they plant a piece of the darkness they carry. The dark angels do not hunt the fallen for glory. They hunt them because the fallen are a living confession that the legion is not immaculate. To admit to the fallen would be to admit to failure. To admit to failure is to unravel the ritual that sustains them. Therefore, the hunt is relentless, precise, and private. It is conducted not on the banners of a battlefield, but in the back alleys of hive cities, in abandoned shrines, in the quiet back rooms of merchant guilds. Men meet in the dark, exchange names, and go away knowing that there will be no public accolade for what they do. And when they catch one of the fallen, what follows is not triumph but an almost surgical cruelty. Questions, extraction, and either death or a fate that is worse. A life of penance hidden away from the world. This obsession has consequences. The more a people looks outward to find their enemies, the more they risk failing to look inward. Obsession narrows the mind. It hardens the heart. It isolates the brothers in their own lonely vigilance, each man a sentinel on his own tower, listening only for the footsteps that indicate betrayal rather than the hand that might reach for comfort. It is often asked, quietly and sometimes with a sharpness that some deny, whether the dark angels are the hunters or the hunted, whether their ceaseless search is a shield that keeps the galaxy safe, or a blade turned inward, carving away at something essential. The answer is not a single word but a dizzying circle. They are both. They are protectors of worlds and jailers of their own conscience. The machinery of their culture adapts to this duality. They have architects of secrecy, masters of disguise who weave false histories to cover their tracks. They have confessors and inquisitors who sift through memories like if they were harvest grain, separating kernels of truth from chaff. They have a lexicon of euphemism that normalizes terrible acts. The adjustment, that is really a purge, the relocation which masks an execution. Language is the first tool they use to domesticate horror. By renaming things, they soften them. By codifying them, they distance themselves. This is the brilliance and the cruelty of ritual. Even their enemies sometimes misunderstand them. To lesser foes, the dark angels are simply the grim, faceless force that arrives, eliminates, and withdraws. The galaxy is a cold place. Many are content to give thanks and not ask why such acts were necessary. But to those who prize civil servants, rival knights, merchants with short memories, there is a chance to see the true cost. Secrets leak, a ledger misplaced, a whisper overheard in a tavern. And when that happens, the Legion moves with the efficiency of something practiced. A steam valve closing before steam can choke a city. All of this, ritual, secrecy, obsession, and duty, feeds into the darker, more intimate reality of their character, a near constant negotiation between what they were and what they have become. That negotiation is not theoretical, it is embodied in the bodies they wear. Consider, for a moment, the armor, layered plates, a nest of servos and joints, a throb of microfusion cores. Ceramite is not just a covering, it is a second skin. Once donned, it changes the wearer's gait, lowers the range of motion, and imposes a new logic on the way a man moves through the world. Over years and centuries, as these suits are repaired, replaced, and reconfigured, they begin to define not only how the wearer fights, but how he thinks. The armor is a teacher. It instructs the Marine in what is necessary and what is expendable. Augmentations are an extension of this same erosion. Bone, tendon, and synaptic nodes replaced with cold, efficient substitutes. They increase stamina, they mute pain. They extend sight into spectra that once belonged only to birds or beasts. And yet, in doing so, they remove certain human limitations that teach humility. If you cannot feel pain in the same way as another, you no longer have the same reason to be careful or to forgive. This is not a moralizing argument against technology. It is an observation. Every replacement is a subtraction that must be accounted for, and the tally is kept in the heart. What does remain then of the human? Small things. A nickname left uncleaned on a helmet. A scrap of fabric from a wife left tucked in the lining of a coat. A prayer hummed in a voice that lowers when the servo motors whine too loud. These are fragile resistances, but they are real. They are the last dregs of warmth in a place where cold doctrine rules. And yet even these small rebellions are not safe from the shadow of their history. The fallen haunt everything. They are memory made flesh. They are the mirrors a brother is forbidden to hold to his face. To see a fallen is to see, in living motion, the reflection of a path one might have taken. And for some, that reflection is intoxicating. For others, it is an unbearable accusation. There is, within the Legion, a spectrum of response to this truth. Some answer with iron and blood. They become exemplars of implacable will, men who have made a covenant with silence so absolute it is almost a religion. They are the ones who patrol the edges of the Imperium and bring back names on a list long and cramped, written in a steady hand. Others turn inward, becoming keepers, archivists, scribes who spend nights in catacombs cataloging. Some find solace in art, small carvings on the inside of helm liners, quiet songs that they teach to no one else. And some break. Breaking is not always dramatic. It is not always a moment of tearing and falling. Sometimes it is a slow erosion, a laugh that stops coming, a prayer that once took the edge off a wound but now only deepens it. Sometimes it is a decision made in a dark corridor, to spare a fallen for reasons of pity, to betray another to save a child, to write a name in private as a reminder that not all warrants easy judgment. These fractures are the true currency of the Legion, and those who manage them become both more humane and more perilous. For in a culture so tightly wounded, mercy can be a revolutionary act. To give a fallen a second chance is to declare that the ledger is not the only way to account for a life. To spare a brother who has sinned is to risk the order's stability. To show compassion is to open a crack through which the light of doubt may enter. Which brings us, inevitably, to the question of leadership and the burdens that rest where the armor is thickest. Primarch, Captain, Inner Circle. These are titles heavy with responsibility. A leader of the Dark Angels is not merely a commander of troops. He is the keeper of stories, the warden of confessions, and the last person who might decide whether a fallen is to be executed or hidden. Every such decision reverberates, often silently, through generations of brothers. The Primarch's shadow is especially curious. Lion L. Johnson, tall, eloquent, distant, was more than a father. He was an ideal. His presence carved the ethos of the Legion into the marrow of its men. But the very majesty of such a figure leaves an absence when he is not present. His choices become scripture and also shackles. When a near-divine leader is bundled away by fate or by betrayal, his absence is a wound. The men he leaves behind will either worship the memory or bury it in ritual so dense that no one can see the shape of what came before. And so the nature of the faction becomes a study in echoes. Every command echoes a Primarch's choice. Every ritual echoes a betrayal. Every hunt for a fallen echoes a sorrowing memory of a brother lost. This is not merely poetic. It changes the way they plan, the way they fight, the way they love and do not love. If you seek to distill their essence into a single sentence, you might say this: the Dark Angels are guardians of shame. They stand at the threshold between public piety and private unreason. Between the shining face they show the Imperium and the shadowed mirror they keep behind closed doors. They are, in equal measure, protectors and penitents. And as protectors, they will perform acts of heroism that are breathtaking in their scope. They will hold a breach alone while an entire world is evacuated. They will throw themselves into voids with the casualness of men who have rehearsed dying many times. They are terrifying to behold in war, perfect instruments of purpose, all geometry and lethal rhythm. And as penitents, they will act with a single-mindedness that chills the bone. They will travel worlds to find a single name on a list. They will spend lifetimes ensuring that a secret never reaches light. They will choose pain as currency for guilt. And they will give their all not merely out of loyalty to an emperor, but out of a deeper, darker compulsion to atone. This compulsion is what ensures they endure. It is also what ensures they are never free. At the center of the Legion, somewhere past the chapels and the armories, past the ledgers and the rituals, there is a place of quiet where the men come to be alone with their memories. They call it different things in hushed tones: the vault, the inner hall, the chamber of remembering. It is a place of small light, and these interior journeys are the most human parts of the Dark Angels, and also the most dangerous. For memories are portals, and some doors, once open, do not close again. It is at these thresholds that the line between guardian and heretic is thinnest. A man may go in to remember and come out changed, softer, riven with doubt, or hollowed and more implacable than before. There is no end to the paradoxes that form the Dark Angels. They are devout and secretive, noble and punitive, humane in private and mechanical in public. They are clad in armor that both protects and isolates them. They hunt those who were once kin, for reasons that are at once moral and self-preserving. They are warriors who have taken an oath to safeguard humanity, and in doing so, have placed themselves on a road where the map is inked in blood. And yet, even beneath all this weight, beneath the centuries of discipline and the 1,000 funerals, there is something that flickers, an ember of a man who once laughed at a joke told under a storm, who once failed and forgave himself, who once forgave another. That ember is small, and the winds that surround it are brutal, but it exists, stubborn and alive. It is the reason why some of them will always resist becoming entirely what they fear, and why others will collapse beneath the pressure and fall. This, then, is the nature of the faction. A cathedral of contradictions, a tribe of quiet men who stand between order and the abyss, armed not only with bolter and blade but with secrets they dare not speak. They are a people of structure and of sorrow. They are both the blade and the wound. As the chapter closes on this meditation, on oaths etched into metal and on memories that refuse to die, the air tightens. The ritual of secrecy continues, but somewhere hidden among the ledgers and the liturgies, the first threads of unease begin to fray. A ledger misplaced will be found. A whisper will be overheard. The hunt continues, but now with a small shift. It has become less steady, more urgent. Where it once walked, it now runs. And when hunters run, they often miss the shape of what they chase. They sweep away underbrush without seeing the pit beneath. They mistake echoes for footsteps. They confuse guilt for truth. In the next hour, the watchers will tighten their belts. The chaplains will count rosary beads until their fingers cramp. And a few men, silent, steady, will go to places where no light reaches. They will do what they have always done. They will search. They will remember. They will try in small, desperate ways to keep the shadow from touching the rest of the world. But shadows have their own gravity. They are patient, and they wait always at the edge of the light. There is a moment before any storm in which the world holds its breath. The sky grows a shade lower, the air feels heavier, and even the smallest sounds, a loose shingle, a bird's distant cry, seem carved from glass. On worlds of wind and water, men learn to read that pause and to brace. In the void, where storms are measured in iron winds and solar flares, the pause is no less real. It arrives as a hush in corridors, as vox chatter thinning to static, as the faint, unnatural cool that slips under layered seals. For the dark angels, that pause is a private thing. It belongs to moments when rituals are done and the small lights go out. It belongs to hospital bays where a Marine's hand lies on a table, as team servitors hum with soft efficiency. It belongs to the places between the ledgers and the liturgies, in the dusty alcoves where relics are kept and examined by hands that never shake in public and sometimes tremble in private, where the first chapter painted the world in slow strokes of legend, and the second examined the bones beneath the armor. This chapter lingers in the spaces where unease begins to worm its way inward. The horror we meet here is not sudden. It does not arrive as an explosion. It comes as a series of small, crooked things that, when assembled, form a pattern none would have accepted at the start. We walk now into those crooked rooms, listen to those small sounds, and let them build minute by minute, until the surface of the calm is broken and something else, older, quieter, and hungrier, slips in. Begin with sound. The ship's hum is a constant, a low thrum that underpins everything. It is the heartbeat of architecture, reactors breathing, pumps cycling, filters whitening the air. In that hum, small variations should be meaningless, a missed beat here, a flutter there. But to an ear made sharp by routine, they are tremors of misalignment. A servo that ticks twice before releasing, a pump that coughs, an LED that stutters then brightens too slowly. At first, the Marines interpret these as maintenance notes, items for logbooks to be corrected by tech adepts with quiet competence. At first, they reassure one another in curt baritone. Mercury cycle failing, I'll note it. Patch it when we reach the next forge world. Practical, reasonable, and crucially distractible. Distractibility is fertile ground for seeds of dread. A techno-chant echoes in the lower decks, a ritual of calibration that the ship's tech marines perform at predictable hours. They walk in measured steps, hands moving with the precision of liturgy, spanners and diagnostic filigree against their wrists. That song is meant to align metal with will. It is meant to reassure the warriors that the machines are obedient. On a certain night, the chant fractures. The rhythm stumbles. The instruments that should reply are slow. When the tech priest leans close to a servo and places a wetted tool to it, there is a whisper of static that might be a language. He closes his optical implants for a breath, a tiny human gesture hidden beneath skullcap and crook, and for a sliver of time, his pupils appear almost wet. He does not say this, of course. He marks the reading, files the report, and moves on. This is how small alarms become quiet conspiracies. It begins with failures no single man imagines fatal, a liminal failure of a limb joint, a patch of necrotic tissue that reddens around a redundant sarcotuber, a vox report that becomes a looped echo of a word never intended for broadcast. A brother's gauntlet does not close all the way. A servo hinge grinds once like a tooth that does not fit. The Medikey screens flash a diagnostic that reads in bureaucratic, antiseptic phrases, microfissures in synaptic nodes, recommend therapy. On paper, a tiny correction. In the quiet places of the mind, an abrasion. Once, a Marine might have laughed at a mechanical cough and called the tech adepts to fix it. Now, the same cough becomes an omen. A mind trained to read patterns sees not random malfunction, but the first letters of a phrase. The human brain is a superstition machine. It loves to string details into meaning. So when multiple engines hawk at once, when a handful of Marines in separate barracks report the same dream, the same half-remembered face, the inner circle sits up and begins to listen in a way they thought they had left behind. Dreams are the first small treacheries. They come like fossils of memory, recurrent images, worn from repetition, drifting into sleep. A brother dreams of a tree with iron leaves. Another dreams of eyes beneath the liner of a helm. Eyes that are not lenses at all but warm and wet in a way the servos are not. They wake, beginning the day with the disciplined roll call and ritual, and dismiss it as fatigue. But there are patterns. Names whispered, fragments of hymns inverted, a single syllable that grazes every dream like a moth. When two veterans on opposite decks report the same symbol, a twisted winged sword, or a sigil smeared with an unfamiliar ooze, it becomes harder to dismiss. Alongside dreams, other small violations begin. Architecture betrays them in ways that can be cataloged. In the armory, a relic sheath bears a hairline scar that is not the result of battle. In the chapel, a candle goes out without the wick being touched. A ledger shows an entry crossed out in a hand that the scribe insists he does not recognize. These are banalities, things that an inner circle investigator could dismiss as human error. But the human heart resents being dismissed by its own order. Each slight seems to ask a quiet question. Who is touching the margins of our lives? The first direct encounter with something outside protocol is a whisper on the Vox that fails to parse. A Marine on routine patrol through a ruined quadrant stops and presses his Palmer Tessera to his lips. The Vox returns a single phrase, half a breath, as if it had been underwater. Remember, he cannot place the voice. It is close, too close, like a brother learnt in childhood. He tells himself it is interference from a nearby conduit. Interference is a comfortable explanation. But when a Vox log is later replayed under scrutiny, the voice is there again, layered beneath static, repeating the same archaic invocation. The word is not one found in their liturgies. It is older, and when the inner circle translates it, the meaning sits like cold metal in the mouth. Reckoning. Reckoning is a word heavy with history for the Dark Angels. It is a ledger term. It is the sound of counting names on a list. Hearing it in their veins is more than coincidence. It is a summons. The Order reacts the way it has always reacted, with a tightening. Patrols increase, the dates on access seals are scrutinized, and a small ring of men, chaplains and chosen captains, are tasked with following the thread. They move like cats into forgotten quarters, press their palms to ancient vault doors, and scent for anything that does not belong. More alarms are noted, more small anomalies discovered. One finds the pattern in the spaces between corpses. A scouting party returns from a moonlit and describes a wrecked shrine where the statues have been melted into shapes that suggest wings and broken faces. Another reports a local cultist cell whose prayers are not to the emperor, but to a machine god of return, a blasphemy, but not a new one. Yet the cult script is inverted, and in the margins there are words that match the glyphs seen in dreams. Someone has been leaving marks, like breadcrumbs, in places where the fallen might walk. Breadcrumbs, the inner circle notes, are tactics of the hunted and the hunter alike. And then there are the voices in the walls. Corrosion of the mind can be literal in a universe rebuilt on metal. Some Marines report a sensation of listening. It is as if the hull itself has learned to hum in a minor key when no engines are running. In the maintenance tunnels where only servitors should tread, there is a whispering wind that cannot be explained by circulation schematics. A tech adept, alone with a diagnostic panel, claims to have heard a voice recite the names of the dead slowly, lovingly, and then bite them off like a surgeon. He swears the cadence was a parody of a funeral rite. In public, he laughs about it. In private, he makes long prayers. Bodies begin to betray their hosts in ways too intimate for logbooks. A veteran once famed for endurance begins to cough blood that is not his color. Under medici lenses, technicians see something like rust under the skin, minute flakes of metallic powder gathering in tissue. It is not wholly a biological corruption, nor wholly mechanical. It is an in-between decay that suggests metal eating bone. When they probe with nanoscopes, they find microfilaments fused with nerve endings, as if the body had been grafting itself to machinery in secret. The Medici Council issues quiet advisories: quarantine, monitor, escalate. But quarantines are porous in a brotherhood that values duty over isolation. A Marine who is quarantined finds himself touched by the hand of a brother through a hatch, a glance exchanged through an intercom. Compassion breaks protocol, and compassion is contagious. At night, the barracks change. The usual low conversation of campaigns and tactics, of victories and losses fades, and an edge appears. Wives remembered with too much detail, old shame rehearsed in soliloquy. A mechanic hums a tune that used to be a child's rhyme, then stops and writes a line on a scrap of paper that he tucks into a helmet liner. When another Marine finds that scrap, he recognizes the handwriting of a comrade who has been dead for decades. The dead's handwriting alive again, a residue or a message, no one can tell. The inner circle calls it anomalous mimetic imprint. Men call it a chill. And then, in a sectariary vault beneath the fortress monastery where texts older than memory are kept, they find a whisper carved into a blade. It is not a voice but a contusion of letters, a cluster of glyphs that is at once familiar and wrong, the winged sword, but warped as though seen through water. When chaplains gather to interpret, their faces pale. The script is in the old tongue, the language of Caliban as preserved in the most secret annals. Translated, it reads not as a prayer but as an insistence. We return to correct what has been forgotten. The resonance of return appears again, in dreams, in leaked vox, in the malformed prayers of a cult. What is most unsettling is not a single horror, but the way these horrors borrow from each other. A dream appears in a Medici report. A scrap of handwriting reappears on an archived helmet. A voice is heard both by a patrolman on a dead moon and by a tech priest in a clean, sealed dome. The Legion's reaction, the tightening, the search, the rituals, gives a rhythm to the intrusions. They are not random. Someone or something anticipates their moves and sometimes preempts them by a breath. In response, the inner circle resorts to measures that are themselves corrosive. They expand secrecy into paranoia. They compartmentalize entire decks. No access without triple keys. No prayer without a witness. They reroute communication through encryption rites that are as much religious as mechanical. The chaplains chant over data slate arrays. Tech priests bless pumps and transformers with oils that smell of ancient incense and machine grease. The air smells different. Not just the cold of vented oxygen, but the acrid tang of worry. Ritual becomes prophylactic. Yet rituals are only defense if the disease is external. When the contagion is narrative, when a symbol or a story can infiltrate like a virus, prayers and oil do not suffice. The dark angels, masters as they are of ceremony, discover an uncomfortable truth. To perform their liturgy is also to hand something to the thing watching, because rituals create patterns and patterns make maps. Each prayer a notch, each hymn a step. The hunters realize too late that their own codes are intelligible. There are glimpses, too, of a different kind of horror, intimate betrayals that cannot be recorded without shivering. In a shuttle house, two brothers share the same cramped space while on convoy. One is restless and confesses, in a voice that quivers, that he once spared a fallen because of a child. The confession is supposed to be absolution. Instead, the other brother, normally a model of stoicism, goes white and grips his bolter so hard that his knuckles blanch. He leaves the room suddenly and does not return for a long time. The man who confessed later disappears into a vent shaft, and when found, his eyes are gone. Not gouged, not broken, simply gone, as if someone had unlatched them and taken a souvenir. The Medici cannot confirm whether this was trauma-fueled hypovolemia or something else. The mental wards send the case as classified. The inner circle does not speak of it, but the rumor, barbaric and unspeakable, spreads. that the Legion will not tolerate mercy where it fears corruption might spread. Mercy, then, becomes a contagion to save the rest from. The line between protection and purging thins. Small acts of empathy, a shared ration, a spare blanket, a private prayer, are now audited. Brotherhood tightens into surveillance. Eyes watch eyes. Men begin to sleep with gauntlets within reach. Chaplains, the usual solace of confession, are now both priests and judges. The very sanctuaries where men once allowed themselves to leak emotion become places of interrogation. Of all the symptoms, the one that gnaws hardest is the sense of being observed by something ancient and patient. It is not merely that the fallen may be out there, or that cultists whisper in hidden corners. It is that something seems to have begun to learn the rhythms of the dark angels, their necessity for ritual, their habit of cataloging, their need to remember names. The Watchers do not come with banners, they come in mimicry. They study the Legion as one might study a blind animal, learn its steps, then teach it to stumble. The final sign that this stage of horror has arrived is not loud. It is a small, domestic violence. A novice returns from a solitary run outside the monastery perimeter and brings back mud that should not exist. Tiny, dark, granular particles that flake like skin when rubbed between fingers. The particles are examined under lenses. They contain organic cells of a species unknown, and within them, a filament of crystalline metal that resonates to certain frequencies. When exposed to the right harmonics, those filaments vibrate and whisper a note that suggests a voice. The tech priests, who had until then been men of measurement and minimized superstition, make a small oath. They do not speak it aloud. They record it in code and seal the recording. The chapter could end here in a manageable way, with men resolving to hunt and purge and recover order. But the nature of this early horror is that it never quite ends comfortably. The search and destroy missions that follow yield trophies: a fallen bayonet, a charred fragment of a relic, a ledger with names that bleed across generations. Each recovery raises more questions. Each answer makes the map of unease larger. The hunters find what they expect and what they do not. They track a fallen to a settlement that has been living as if time had turned back. The people wear the old sigils in faded embroidery. They are kind, at first, hospitable, until the hunters notice that the children hold knives made from the same metal as the filaments. The villagers speak in a dialect that occasionally slips into the same archaic word heard in dreams. The atmosphere is thick with unease. When the hunt finally corners the fallen, he does not fight like a soldier. He stands and recites words that sound like prayer but bend like a blade. He speaks of repair, of reclaiming what was given up. He speaks of making things whole by any means. The battle is quick and brutal. The fallen dies or is taken, reports differ. What remains is a scrap of cloth soaked in a tar-like substance that resists flame. It peels like old skin. When a scribe examines it under sanctified light, microglyphs appear, glinting beneath the weave. They are instructions, they are promises. They are, in translation, fragments of a litany: return, mend, correct. The inner circle stows the cloth with reverent hands, but in the privacy of their chambers they do not give thanks. They grow wary. A single line settles in their thoughts like a burr that cannot be pried out. What if the fallen are not merely traitors but patients, or missionaries? What if their exile is not a simple fall, but a severing that something else now seeks to mend? The notion is repugnant and unacceptable, yet it settles like frost. By the end of this early stage, the monastery hums with a different frequency. The old rituals continue, but with an edge. Men pray with eyes open. Tech priests polish circuits with the same tenderness a man gives to a relic. Chaplains read rosters not for names but for absence. The inner circle eats less and sleeps less. They double-lock inner vaults. They tokenize the names of the fallen in new ledgers that are buried even deeper. They whisper plans but hurl words like stones. They suspect infiltration and they plan purge. And in the deepest hours, when the ship drifts and the stars are distant and indifferent, someone somewhere taps a pattern into the hull. 3 slow knocks, then a pause, then 2, an echo in the architecture. It is the ancient code used to call the fallen home or to mark a rendezvous. It sounds like a mistake, like a glitch, like a child knocking on a door. But that knock is not a mistake. It is a summons that cuts through the hush and asks a question the dark angels do not want to hear. Are you certain you can hold what you hide? The answer is not ready, and that is the point. The question hangs like smoke. Hunters stalk. Watchers watch. Men sleep with their hands close to their faces. The world tilts just enough that a single misstep will cost more than a helmet or a name. The horror has not yet shown its teeth fully. It is still gathering its appetite. But the meal will not be small. The Legion has opened a wound that will not heal cleanly. The edges are raw and nervous. In the next chapters, the small things will conspire into larger ones, and the warmth of the beginning will shiver into cold. The hunters had always prided themselves on rhythm. Patrol, search, interrogate, record, forget, as if forgetting were its own kind of ritual. Yet rhythm is also metronome. It marks tempo, and tempo tells when a thing quickens. In the days after the knock and the strange filaments, the tempo of the fortress monastery shifted. What had been a steady march became a drum roll, at first measured, then insistent, then unbearably fast. If the early disturbances had been complaints, taps on a window, a cough in the ventilation, this stage was a demand. Small failures multiplied. Systems that had been tidy and reliable broke in cascading patterns. Medikey arrays flickered in unison. A whole battery of servitors froze mid-task. Chapel lights went out while prayers were still in air. The inner circle, which had long translated such patterns into policy, now translated them into dread. They appointed more hunters. They designated more sanctuaries. They forged more chains. But the watchers outside the monastery learned quickly how to live in the seams. The spaces between watch changes, the blind corners left by roving patrols, the hours when even a machine must stop to cool. It was as if the thing that watched had become a student of patience. The first close encounter came on a night when the stars outside the observation ports were washed to soft, distant coals. A reconnaissance team led by Brother Captain Merrick of the Raven Wing took a shuttle to a dead mining platform on an asteroid the maps had marked as a routine salvage. The platform was small and useless by Imperial standards: canted pylons, slagged machinery, the skeletal ribs of harvesters. It should have yielded scrap and little else. They found instead a chapel, not carved like the monastic shrines of the Legion. This one had been grown. Filaments like crystalline roots bound the pylons, and they had been woven into shapes that suggested archways and alcoves. Inside, in the dim blue light of failing lumens, were figures. Not living, not holy, they stood motionless with relics of the dark angels at their breast. Helmets, a tattered banner, a serrated blade. Their bodies had been recombined with the platform's architecture. Tendons became wire, ribs threaded with copper, skin fused to brass plating. Their eyes were closed or absent. Where faces should have shown scars and years, there was only a pattern of circuitry grown like a mold. Merrick stood with his hand on the hilt of his Reaper chainsaw, and for a long heartbeat he felt something he had not admitted in years. Nausea. He smelled wood smoke and then metal and then a child's breath, as if the dead had been singing to themselves before being arranged. He ordered the men to take samples, to prepare for extraction. They looped the chapel and marked its coordinates, and then one of the tech marines leaned in with a probe and touched a filament. It answered. The filament shivered like a string struck. A tone ran up through the probe like a note, an inversion of a canticle. The tech marine's optic implants flooded with images that were not of the machine. A child under a tree, a storm on Caliban, a door slamming shut. He staggered back and vomited. He tried to speak, and all that came out was a knot of words. Return, mend, correct. Then the filament shimmered and the images drained like ink. They brought one of the figures back to the monastery in a sealed stasis sarcophagus. The inner circle argued until they were hoarse. Some wanted to burn it and erase any trace. Some insisted on study. The debate ended by the decree of silence that always ended such debates. It would be placed in the vault for analysis, in the care of both chaplains and tech priests. Among those assigned was Brother Serf Elian, a Medici technician whose hands trembled only when he thought of his wife who had died on a farming world 2 centuries prior. He called her name under his breath as the sarcophagus doors closed. The analysis should have been sterile. Instead, it became a seance. Elian placed his instruments against the composite skin of the figure and watched the readouts drift into rhythms that resembled cardiac output, not mechanical pulses, not purely neural fire. Something had grafted life to alloy in postures that mimicked suffering, and in the glow of his instruments, Elian heard, with a clarity that made him lay down his tools and press his forehead against the lid, not the mechanical shiver of data, but a sound like someone humming the lullaby his mother used to sing. He wept and no one stopped him. If one man wept for a name he had kept secret, others began to look inward and count what they would do for the same temptation. To take a life, any life, and piece it back as they imagined it might have been. The notion seeped into the brotherhood like a solvent through brass. It became an infestation of thought. What if the fallen were not monstrous traitors, but wronged men who could be made whole by new forms of life? What if the machine that was their curse might also be their cure? Questions that had been whispered in the dark now schooled themselves in daylight. As these arguments played out in hushed conclaves, the corruption grew more literal. Men began to show symptoms that no Medici chart had the language to describe. Sergeant Haru, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, awoke one morning with his right forearm swollen and mottled. At first, the Medici attributed it to a burst capillary or a fungal infection. But when they lanced the swelling, what poured out was not pus but a viscous, glittering residue, microfilaments swimming in serum, like a nest of glass worms. Each filament lodged upon the nerves with a tenderness that made Haro scream in a voice that rattled the corridors. They tried to cut it away. The filaments had woven themselves in a lattice, and severing them produced a noise like small bells. The Medici Council debated the etiology in technical terms: nanocontaminants, symbiotic xenoorganisms, mimetic vectors. The chaplains who listened for spiritual signs used different words: sacrilege, unmaking, trial. The inner circle used more blunt language: infection. They interdicted the wards around Haro and placed him under observation. Haro, who had once smiled at the taste of battle, now begged with childlike voice to be allowed to join the hunt for the fallen, as if the filaments that had fused to his skin were themselves an imperative that would find peace in violence. Another man, a tech adept named Korin, found that his augmentations no longer obeyed his will. His ocular filters adjusted to a frequency that made the chapel lights bleed into halos, and his manipulator servos slipped into motions that suggested a memory not his own. Once, while performing a routine calibration on reaction tanks, his hands bent in a way they had not been meant to bend, and a spat of coolant vapor formed a shape that, when condensed on his visor, looked like a child's face. He broke the vial and screamed until his throat was raw. He refused to speak of it, and then he stopped sleeping at all. Sleep became a casualty across the barracks. The dreams that had once been private returned as shared. Multiple men waking from the same nightmare in different bunks, each murmuring the same phrase and the same plea, as if threaded into a chorus by an unseen hand. The inner circle attempted to trap the dreams in their own nets, administered sedatives, ran cognitive scrubs, broadcast counter hymns across the barracks. For a while it worked, like a bandage over a wound. But a bandage does not heal, it only hides. The dreams adapted. They began to play with memory, showing a favorite field, then overlaying it with metal, playing a child's laugh at the same speed as a servo whine. The unexpected cruelty of the crescendo was not only that it hurt the body, but that it began to twist meaning. Rituals turned into traps. A hymn once sung to soothe a dying man now echoed on a loop in maintenance ducts. A recording picked up and replayed in exchange for energy pulses. creating an oral parasite that nested within the chapter's liturgy. Men who listened too long said they felt a pull, not to confession, but to something else, an inclination toward taking and making. A choir master found that when he led prayer, his hands moved with the unnatural grace of a surgeon sewing bone to bronze. He woke with stitches in his palms that he had not made. Horror, when it crescendos, often precedes by betrayal. The Legion's own strengths, its organization, its secrecy, the discipline of its warfare, turned into vectors for infection. Their closed networks became predictable. Their rituals became latched scripts that could be intercepted and answered. The watchers outside the monastery used the Legion's precision against them, replaying fragments of doctrine back through the comms with subtle alterations. Broadcasts meant to coordinate patrols arrived with an extra clause, a soft instruction: repair what is broken. Commands that once called for custody now suggested making whole. The inner circle redoubled encryption, but encryption cannot keep a man from reading a half-heard plea. And always the whispers returned to one concept, like a refrain: return. Return to what had been lost. Return to a shape that includes both bone and bolt. Return to a family made whole not by forgiveness but by architecture. The theology of the thing, if theology it was monstrous in its hospitality. It did not demand sacrifice so much as it promised reclamation. That reclamation manifested in acts that wrenched at the marrow. A patrol discovered a village where the fallen had built machines to cradle the dying. Cradles lined with filaments wrapped false skin around bones and coaxed warmth into dead tissue with a patience that took months. At the heart of the village stood a crucible, and within it bones arranged like keys. The fallen murmured as if in prayer while they inserted microfilaments into sockets. The villagers, hollow-eyed, serene, regarded the hunters without fear, their hands open, as if they had been promised a reunion. The hunters killed some, took others when they could, but the impression lingered. The fallen were not simply barbarians. They were craftsmen of a perverse sort of mercy. This blurred the moral calculus for many. Officers who had once advocated for unyielding purges found themselves hesitant, hearing in the fallen's work the echo of a lost brother, which was precisely the point. The Watchers wanted more than to provoke fear. They wanted to provoke fracture. They wanted to turn the dark angels inward until they could not tell whether the enemy was without or within. In the confusion came betrayal. Not all betrayals were grand. Most were quiet and raw. Brother Marshal Vale, a man who had led hundreds into battle and returned with nothing but honor, walked into a crypt and found the mural there altered. The mural honored a victory against Xenos. Now it bore, carved into stone, a message in a child's hand: bring him back. Vale's hand shook with a memory he had not allowed himself to keep, the face of a brother he had had to execute for treachery decades before. He stood in the crypt long enough for frost to form on his throat, and when he left, his walk was different. He had been a pillar, now he was a fisher. The fishers multiplied. Men who had sworn to hunt the fallen began to hide names on their lists. They wrote in slanted script so that only certain eyes could read. They diverted patrols. They hid relics in private chapels and tendered them with the same affection one would give a child's keepsake. The inner circle noticed the deviations and tightened discipline, but discipline cannot bind the heart's treacheries. It can only punish them after they are made. Punishment came, and it was terrible. Trials were convened in secret. Dozens of men, some captains, some serfs, were arraigned for sedition against the Legion. Some were boiled in silence, their confessions recorded and then muffled. Others were given a fate more peculiar: to be bound to machines in the old way but not destroyed. They were transformed into living reliquaries, bodies fixed in positions of devotion, their mouths sewn, their eyes replaced with crystals that pulsed with a slow light. They were placed in chapels not as men but as warnings, examples of what compassion led to. The sight of them haunted the barracks. Men looked away quickly and then slept with their hands over their faces. And yet, even such brutality did not stop the escalation. If anything, it sharpened it. The Watchers responded to each punishment as if counting a ledger entry in their favor, not in repentance. They adapted. Their filaments learned to avoid the filters and probes. They mimicked, more convincingly, the rhythms of the chapter. They also learned to ask in sweeter tones. Where before there had been commands, now there were pleas disguised as confessions. I could fix him. Let me. I know the name. I can bring back his face. The pleas worked on men who had loved and lost, on men who kept tiny shrines of memory beneath their armor. They worked on the medici whose hands had once mended a child's broken leg, and who still could hum the lullaby of those lives. The crescendo became more violent. A full-scale attack came not from without but within the heart of the monastery. In the archive hall, where the oldest ledgers lay, a technician reported seeing his mentor move like a puppet, reciting a genealogy that ended with no name. He tried to stop him, and the mentor turned. His face was a map of years, and then nothingness, the features smoothed as if a hand had brushed wet clay. He did not speak. He reached into the equipment and placed a small, crystalline filament into the archive's main relay. The relay hummed, and the stone shelves around it shivered like skin. Then the mentor fell to his knees and began to chant a prayer not to the emperor, but to a language the monks had not heard since Caliban's myths. It asked for return. It asked for mending. It asked for correction. The archive hall sealed itself as alarms blared. A riot squad moved in. When they opened the vault, the image was grotesque. Books fused to wire, ink running like blood, pages grown with metallic veins. A single volume lay open, a ledger. The ledger's entries shifted as eyes watched, names rearranging, crossouts reappearing as ink bloomed. The inner circle took the book away and burned the pages in a private pyre, but ashes were a poor solution for iron. They swept the floors, scrubbed the stone, and still a filmy residue remained that smelled faintly like the Cradle Village's metal. It clung to soles of boots. It lodged in teeth. It found new corners. And then came the night of the bells. The monastery's great bell tower had not tolled in centuries. It was preserved as a relic of the Legion's old vows. Yet at midnight, a sequence of chimes rang out across the compound. 3 slow, 2 quick pause, then 3 long. It was the same pattern struck on the hull a month earlier, an echo magnified into clangor. Men stood in their bunks listening as if someone had slit open their chests to let the wind in. The inner circle sent squads to the tower and found no intruders, only a single med tech, his hands folded around a small filament like a rosary. He wore the face of a man who had been mended many times and who now looked as if he had been unstitched. When questioned, he only said, in a voice like rust, "They are gathering the names. They will call and call until the ledger is full." There was a moment when the leadership considered withdrawing, evacuating the fortress and walking away to let the infection die in the cold of space. But withdrawal is a kind of confession in the Dark Angel's lexicon, and confession was not something they could afford. So they doubled down. They sealed corridors, burned names from rosters, executed those who smuggled relics out under cover of night. They prayed in louder voices and with less devotion, but the louder prayers made the filaments answer, for they fed on pattern and responded with pattern of their own. By the time the crescendo reached its apex, there were no more pretenses. The monastery had become a stage upon which the old hymn of duty and the new litany of return clashed in a terrible duet. The liturgies that had once bound men together now cleaved them apart because they had become instruments both for healing and for making whole. Men were forced into choices that tore at everything they had sworn: to heal or to burn, to restore or to erase, to love or to unmake. It was in the hush after a failed exorcism that the true depth of the threat showed itself. Brother Canon Ryan, a man whose hands were consecrated in rites, and whose voice had soothed the fiercest recruits, attempted to burn one of the recovered villagers alive in the open square, reciting purifying words as flames licked the woven filaments. The villager smiled with a calmness that unnerved even the hardened. As the fire took hold, the filaments resisted combustion. They glowed, and in their glow images played moments of childhood, hands in hands, a mother's face. Ryan staggered back and his prayer broke into a scream. The filaments reached toward him, not in malice but in what looked like a plea. They reached for the touch that meant belonging. Ryan fell to his knees and, in a voice that shook the night, confessed. He confessed not to a sin but to a longing. I would have her back. He sobbed like a child while the village's filaments pulsed with an unnerving serenity. The congregation watched. Some pulled Ryan away. Some watched with the hollow, hungry ache of those who had lost. Some, in secret corners, made notes and sent them up the chain as suggestions. This fracturing did what the Watchers could not have done alone. It turned brothers into rivals, loyalty into a ledger entry, and mercy into an ember that smoked in the rooms where men could no longer agree if it was warm or poisonous. The crescendo did not end in a clear act of destruction. It ended in the slipping of the ground beneath every man's feet. The fortress monastery did not fall in a roar. It tilted, ever so slightly, into uncertainty. And in that tilt, the Watchers smiled, or what passed for a smile in the machinery of their purpose. They had always desired not merely to infect, but to transform. They had wanted to make the Legion choose between two paths and watch the path pick itself. The Legion chose, not unanimously, not cleanly, not without horror. It chose in fragments and in whispers and in acts of both cruelty and compassion. By dawn, lists had been rewritten. Some names were crossed out. Some were circled and erased. A handful of men vanished in the night, taken for their own protection or for examination. Others took their own lives rather than be instruments of whatever future was being stitched. The inner sanctums filled with a low, mournful chatter like wind through dead leaves. The technicians counted losses and cataloged the new symptoms. The chaplains prayed louder. The captains drilled harder. No one slept. The crescendo had done its work. It had taken the Legion, proud, secretive, and armored in the confidence of their oaths, and opened the membrane between duty and desire. It had shown that the dark space within a man could be filled with 1,000 things, some holy, some monstrous. It had taught them that repair could be as dangerous as rot, and that the line between the two was as thin and sharp as a filament. At the center of the storm, where the vaults had once been clean and the ledgers cleanly kept, a single filament lay in a pool of light. It vibrated faintly, like a throat preparing to sing. The inner circle locked the doors and watched it. Some saw it as the last shred of evidence to be studied. Others felt a needle of temptation in their bones. They would not be unanimous in what they did next. The thing had set its tempo. The phase that followed would be swift. And outside the compound, in the cold hollows between stars, the pattern pulsed like a distant heart, 3 slow, 2 quick. In the wake of the crescendo, all ears strained for the sound of the next movement. The heart of the monastery had never felt smaller. Corridors that once promised safety narrowed like throats. Vault doors that had been symbols of impenetrability now seemed like lids pressed too hard on something that would not stop moving beneath. The inner circle's maps, once confident rectangles and measured circles, had become scrawled margins, red ink, and the frantic shorthand of men who had stopped trusting their own instruments. By the time the clamps went down across the archive hall, most men had already stopped pretending to be surprised. They moved with a tired precision that is the last grace of an army near collapse. Steady hands, shaved heads, boots that did not falter. Captain Merrick's eyes had the hard, narrowed focus of a man who has made a dozen decisions he cannot undo. Elian kept his hands in clean gloves and pretended they did not shake. Corin Servos coughed when he walked. Vale had not spoken a word since he found the child's scrawl on the mural. Ryan had retreated to the chapel and prayed without joining anyone. The alarms began as a low mechanical warning, and then became something else. A layering of bells and recorded canticles, and the shudder of servos whining in unison. It was not the monastery that sounded an alarm. It was the monastery being read. Its tone sampled and turned inside out until the message was no longer one of warning but of invitation. They found the first incursion where curiosity should have been minimal. The vault. The vault was designed to be boring. It had dead air, the smell of stone, and the heavy, calming thrums of backup power. It should have contained only records and relics that no sane mortal would touch without ritual. But when the inner circle opened the chamber, they found a geometry of bodies. Men lay arranged like offerings in a pattern so precise it looked designed by a liturgist. Their arms had been extended and fixed to iron frames. Their heads were tilted toward a central plinth where a filament coiled like a sleeping serpent. Helmets lay beside them, uncracked, as if put down by hands that were both careful and ceremonial. The men's lips were parted in the same pose of supplication. On their chests, where a nameplate should have been, lay small glyphs, filigreed in metal. The glyphs pulsed when Elian approached, and in the pulses the Medici instruments read a rhythm that matched a human heart, slow, tired, but unmistakably alive. "Who?" Merrick began. Elian, the technician who had wept over the chapel figure, knelt without waiting for orders. He placed his palm over a face and felt life under the metal. The man's eyes fluttered, not in focus but in patterns. When Elian tried a simple vocal test, the man breathed out a phrase that split the air into two halves, a prayer and a command. "Mend me," he said. His voice was threadbare. The inner circle found themselves in a conversation without a center. One faction wanted to incinerate the vault and throw the ashes into vacuum. Another wanted to claim the bodies and treat them as holy. Failed experiments, yes, but perhaps salvageable. A third wanted to question them, to attempt to learn whether the filaments could be pried out or whether they had become, somehow, a new tissue. In the end, bureaucracy and ritual carried the day. The bodies were not destroyed. They were taken for study under the strictest seals. The seals lasted 3 days. On the 4th night, a bell pealed in the dead hours, soft, like a child's toy, and the vault seals answered with a chorus no one had planned for. The men within woke and sang. What came next was not a battle of bodies but of names. The filaments did not simply wound, they spoke. They coaxed. They whispered the names of people who had been buried, forgotten, or executed. They spoke of mothers who had been left alone. They spoke of boys in fields, of hands that had once held a brother's face and been broken for it. Each voice was tailored to the one who listened. An old lullaby, a merchant's promise, the exact cadence of a girl's laugh. Men cried. Men confessed. Men stood and walked into corridors with no plan but to follow the voice that had called them. Merrick watched one of his sergeants go pale and step forward, as if called by a cord around his chest. He followed him down a corridor and stopped a half-breath before a maintenance hatch. Inside, the sergeant reached and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. He unrolled it with hands that trembled, a child's wooden toy, blackened by time. The sergeant wept with a sound that had no practiced modulation. "She lost this," he said, as if admitting a sin. "I could give it back." The inner circle had to pry him away. These were not mere hallucinations. Instruments recorded low-frequency harmonics embedded in the filaments. The tech adepts, urgent and inquisitive, attempted to parse the harmonics and turned pale when patterns matched not machine code but liturgical rhythms. Sequences that mapped to vows, to confessions, to names. Threads of memory and codes intertwined until the distinction between a machine's algorithm and a man's prayer blurred into a single thing that asked for attention and gave back commitment in exchange. The monastery was cleaving from within. Brothers who had stood shoulder to shoulder were now strangers in their own mutterings. Baptisms of metal and bone were converting men in the dark of the shops and in the hush of the apothecaries. The command council convened with the austerity of those who have lost faith in their own ceremonies. They assigned sector squads to find the origin point. They called in tech priests to burn the filaments with arc saws. They called in chaplains to pronounce anathema. The tech priest saws sang like banshees and flared the skin. Filaments recoiled like living things and reformed. Chaplains shouted invocations. The last of their voices came back mangled. It was Corin who discovered that the filaments had a tolerance. After 10 attempts to cleave a filament, the saw's teeth dulled as if they had struck not metal but memory. Corin's ocular bench recorded micro-patterns emerging in the filament structure, shapes that echoed heraldry, old script mutated into ribs of alloy. He sat very still in the dim of his lab, as if listening for the moment someone would call him to account. He covered his face with the palms of his hands and wept without sound. At the heart of the vault's chaos there was a point, a throat, where the filaments pooled. It was small, the size of a fist, and it glowed with a dim internal light. The tech adepts labeled it a node. Elian called it a heart. The captains called it a hazard. The inner circle called it a question they would answer. Elian argued for study. "It is giving us the names we have lost," he said. "We can learn. We can." He stopped because his words were inadequate. There were others who saw the node and did not see mercy but certainty. Brother Marshal Vale, who had held banners in his hands through 50 campaigns and had once executed his own for treason, walked to the node and pressed his palm against the glass of containment. For a breath, his jaw worked. "If this is an engine of seduction," he said, "it must be ripped out." He called for the blade. The blade was no ordinary weapon. It had been used in rites and executions, its edge tempered in a fire that had drank names. It had been called many things: the rededicator, the naming blade, the severing. When Vale grasped it, his hands fit the hilt as if they had been molded to it. The inner circle watched with a mixture of dread and relief. Vale moved toward the node with the blade held high, not like an oath but like a verdict. For a moment the monastery held its breath. The node hummed. The filaments twitched like the whiskers of a beast that recognizes a hunter. Vale brought the blade down. The sound that followed was wrong. Not a clean cut. Not even the grinding closure of metal. The blade did not sever. It met resistance that was not resistance. The node answered by flaring, and when Vale tried again, the air filled with the scent of old fields and a child's laughter. The rededicator screamed and Vale fell to his knees, the blade clattering from his hands. When he scrambled to his feet, his face had changed. There was a new softness around his mouth. He reached into his chest, uncertain hands searching for an absence, and realized with a drop of ice in his throat that something had been returned. Not to him, to someone else. In the chaos that followed, command fractured. Men who had been certain of their vows found themselves wanting to know what name the filaments had whispered. Some took pills to dull the lure. Others instead went without sleep for days to deny dream its hunger. A small faction, led by a man named Brother Captain Joris, broke away from the inner circle's decree. They moved in the night and opened a maintenance hatch that led to the underdecks. There they found a network of filaments threaded not only through the vault, but into the monastery itself, veins running along pipes and through ballast tanks, woven into the very bones of the place. "Someone built this here," Joris whispered into the dark. "We have been their garden." The Watchers had not merely infiltrated, they had cultivated. When the hunters traced the filaments to their origin, they did not find a single enemy but a structure, a cruciform array embedded in the heart of a forgotten reactor. It was constructed of alloy and bone, of prayer-etched circuitry and braided skin, and at its center stood a thing that was not wholly machine and not wholly human. Its face, if it could be called that, was a lattice of mirrors, fragments of helmets, shards of lenses, a child's wooden toy fused into a grim smile. It smelled of hearth smoke and oil. It spoke when a sergeant touched one of its tendrils and then staggered back and laughed and then wept. The voice was collective, soft and patient, made of hundreds of memories braided into a single tone. It spoke of return. It spoke of mending what had been torn. It did not name God or emperor. It named need. "We were lost," it said, and an image came to each man who listened, no two the same, but each one perfect to the ear and the heart. A face that had once been loved, a hand that had once warmed a child's cheek. The men who listened found themselves reaching for consolation as if it were a wound. Some of them wept openly, some of them cursed, some of them took a step forward, hands outstretched. It was Brother Captain Merrick who moved first in action and last in certainty. He raised his bolter and fired into the thing's lattice. Bolter rounds fragmented as though against thin glass, scattering shards of helmet and bone across the reactor's floor. The lattice did not fall. Instead, the tendrils reached toward Merrick and, with the tenderness of a mother, pressed small filaments against his face. They did not bite, they hummed. Merrick's knees went weak. For a breath, his mind gave him the boy he had lost on a farming world. For a breath, the smell of freshly turned soil filled the cavern. He lowered his weapon and then, in a movement that horrified even himself, he stepped forward and let the filaments touch his brow. He felt then as if a hinge in his skull had opened. Images flooded him, the faces of men he had executed, the ledger of names he had kept. He saw himself not as captain, but as a child who had been told that to forget was to be forgiven. Tears ran down his cheeks. He laughed. He laughed as if he had been promised absolution. Someone screamed and then another, and it was as if a door had been opened not to a room but to many rooms. Men struck at the lattice in alternately violent and worshipful motions. The fortress became a choir of conflicting intents. A priest attempted to exorcise the presence and found himself blessing with both hands. A tech adept tried to burn it and found his flame shorn to nothing. Some men, under the lattice's soft persuasion, abandoned weapons and curled into fetal positions until the filaments wrapped them like swaddling clothes. This was the horror in its cyclonic form, not the loss of a life, but the conversion of will. The Watchers did not demand blood. They offered balm and in the same breath stitched the two together. They did not shout for surrender. They taught the words that make a man forgive himself. And forgiveness is poison in a people whose whole structure is built to punish the self. The inner circle tried every known measure: censures, excommunications, the binding of names to iron keys. Some of these devices worked, if working is the right word. They did not stop the filaments, but they turned their focus. Filaments that had favored medici wards shifted to the armories, to the sanctuaries, to the places where children's toys, secreted away by men against their own grief, were kept. The Watchers opened new paths of temptation, teaching the fingers of those who held them to shape small miracles. The recovery of a child's laugh from the breath of a man who had died. Each miracle was paid for with a small payment. The surrender of a secret, a name, a memory. In the end, it was not by blade nor by flame that the node was stilled. It was by decision, and decisions are human things. Elian, who had wept at the chapel figure, and who had loved a wife who existed now only as a name in his sleep, went to the central cruciform array carrying with him a relic no one else had touched for fear of its history. A small, sun-blemished mirror inscribed with the lion's sigil. He had stolen it from a private chapel years ago when longing had outweighed obedience. He had kept it in a pocket until his hands shook when he touched it. No, the inner circle told him. It will draw them further. Yes, Elian answered. It will show us what we already are. He stepped into the reactor cavern while alarms screamed and men fought and worshipped in equal parts around him. He carried the mirror as if it could not only show but decide. When he lifted it toward the lattice, the mirror did not reflect the tangle of bone and alloy and toy. It reflected a face, his face, old and patient and afraid. He felt the memory of his wife like a pressure in his chest. The filaments shuddered. For a moment, all of the monastery's tumult seemed to pause to watch. Elian spoke, not the words of the machine god nor the emperor's prayer, but the small, private speech one gives at a bedside. If you mend, he said, then mend by asking. Ask for what you took. Ask for the names you cannot keep. Ask without stealing what makes us human. The lattice reached toward the mirror with 1,000 tiny hands. The filaments touched Elian's fingertips and pulled back as if they had found in him an ache and not an enemy. The mirror's surface pulsed, and for an instant so violent it seemed like a strike. The images that the filaments offered came not as balm but as accusation. Elian saw the faces again. Not only his wife but those he had betrayed in small council rooms. the men he had kept from a mercy because mercy might endanger them. He saw, in patient, terrible clarity, all the ledger entries he had helped maintain. He understood then what the filaments had offered, not a cure but a mirror, not a making whole but the return of memory, raw, unedited, and unbearable. To be mended by the lattice was to remember what you had done and to forgive the one who had done it. For some, forgiveness would be relief. For others, it was execution. The lattice did not care. It offered the same thing to all, the restoration of what had been severed. Whether that restoration was salvation or damnation depended on the man who received it. Elian raised the mirror and let it catch the node's light. For a single, clear instant the cruciform array trembled and then unmade itself. The filaments recoiled as if burned. A pressure collapsed. Men dropped to the floor, clutching their heads. For some it was a blessed blackout. For others it was the beginning of a new kind of mourning. The node's glow dimmed and then snapped. Silence fell that was not peace but exhaustion. The monastery lay in a heap of the two. Some men lay dead where they had fallen. Some lay breathing but not awake. The filaments, once bristling in every channel, hung limp like vines after frost. The lattice, stripped of its chorus, looked like a thing whose jokes had been told once too long. Elian sat back on his heels and realized his hands bled where the filaments had touched him. He looked at his palms and saw long, faint lines etched like script beneath his skin. In the lines, names flickered, names he had not known he kept. He understood as his knees began to tremble that the lattice had not merely wanted to mend, it wanted to be known. It had wanted the ledger of their souls. The inner circle convened in the ruined vault and did what they always did. They logged, numbered, and filed. They cataloged losses, they inventoried survivors, they rewrote ledgers. But something had shifted. The ledger entries looked the same on paper, yet not the same beneath the ink. Men who had been kept in line by the illusion of control now bore the memory that control had been an economy of pain. There were those who said the lattice had been an agent of the machine god, seeking to perfect the human form by reintegrating flesh and alloy. There were those who said it was a voice of chaos, a lie told by 1,000 long fingers of the warp. Others said it had been neither, a relic of Caliban's old heresies, a machine left by men who had once tried to rewrite death. No answer satisfied that lasted beyond a night. Each explanation became a new ritual, and rituals are ways of refusing to admit ignorance. What mattered in the raw morning that followed was not the origin but the consequence. The monastery would bear scars. Men would never be again as they were. Some captains who had marched with rifles now kept small toys in their pockets. Some tech adepts would not operate servos without humming an old lullaby. Some chaplains wore their chains more loosely, as if to remind themselves that discipline could not be the only refuge. And in the middle of all this change, a small detail lodged where doctrine could not sweep it away. A filament had been severed and left behind in Elian's glove. It shimmered faintly like a pulse. Elian tied it to the inside of his coat as one ties a talisman. He did not know whether he did it out of defiance or memory. He only knew that when he slept that night, he dreamt not of a lattice, but of a child running toward him with a face he had not seen in years. The child called his name. The climax had been reached and broken. The lattice lay silent, but the questions it raised remained like smoke. Had they won by cleverness or by a mercy of their own? Had Elian's mirror shown them truth, or merely redirected a machine's hunger into images that would pacify it? Had the lattice been stilled or merely postponed? The inner circle could not tell. The ledger grew longer. In the days that followed, acts of tenderness and brutality happened with equal currency. Some men who had given into the filament's call were quietly consecrated into brotherhood again if they could be trusted. Others were led off in silence and punished by methods that left no record worth reading. The monastery sealed some halls forever. It opened others to the light. The tech adepts burned, then cataloged, then burned again. The chaplains adjusted their prayers. Elian kept his filament hidden in his coat. Each dawn he would touch it with his thumb and feel a faint warmth. He would think of his wife and wonder whether the lattice had given him back the true shape of his grief, or had merely read his ledger and offered him what it thought he wanted. He would wonder, too, whether what he had done was salvation or erasure. Men spoke in low voices of names restored. Some names were simple. Sons come back from slag heaps, fathers remembered, faces sewn into the mind. Others were impossible, names for men who had been dead for centuries, names that did not belong to this age. The monastery collected them all because that is what such institutions do. They place bones in boxes and tag them as if tagging can fix the fact that a thing once lived. And somewhere, beyond the fortress monastery's battered walls, someone listened and learned. The lattice had not been an ephemeral sermon but a pupil with a new lesson. It had cataloged what made the dark angels vulnerable, their rituals, their need to name, their hunger to remember. It had studied the ledger and learned how to become scripture. In the ash and exhaustion of the aftermath, the inner circle gathered for a last closed session. They felt their hands lighter and heavier at the same time, as if some weight had been removed and another, more ambiguous one had been placed. They spoke in clipped tones about policy, more eyes on inner vaults, more checks on relic handling, an increase in the punishment for unauthorized mercy. They wrote new entries, signed new decrees, and in their hearts they prayed, some to the emperor, some to the dead, and some, quietly, to nothing at all. Elian walked out of the meeting late and by himself. He went to the chapel not out of ritual, but because he wanted to see a simple thing, how a small candle burned. He carried the filament in his pocket like a shard of the night. He knelt and lit a candle and let the single flame make a circle small and honest. He stayed there until the sun, small and wrong on an artificial horizon, rose. When he left, a sergeant from the Raven Wing found him at the gate and touched his shoulder. "We held," the sergeant said. His face was raw. "We will watch." Elian nodded and did not answer. Around the monastery, men began to resume duties. The knot of fear had not untied, only frayed. They would patrol and catalog and wage an internal war of vigilance. And in the long nights they would also remember. What the inner circle did not do was put the ledger away. It remained open on the table, its pages filling with names and scribbles. They had learned that naming could be a tool of repair and a weapon of control. They had learned that memory is both door and key. They had learned that what comes offering to mend may be a monstrous kindness. And so they waited, for signals, for patterns, for the day when the node would pulse again. They made plans not only to destroy but to defend. They bound new vows into their liturgies and made secret addenda to their lists. They tightened seals and softened faces. Outside, in the dark between stars, something that had once been called a lattice pulsed faintly like a heart left in sleep. It had been stilled, but not put to death. It had learned the ledger and had learned to ask. It slept, perhaps, or perhaps gathered itself to sing once more. Elian pressed his hand to the filigreed marks beneath his skin and whispered his wife's name as if it were a prayer and allowed himself, for a moment, to believe that whatever had happened in the vault had been, however terrible, final. They were not certain. They were not ever certain again. The days after the vault were slow and ceremonial as funerals. The fortress monastery, which had once thrummed with the tidy confidence of practiced ritual, moved now with a carefulness that felt like a bandage around a wound. Deliberate, protective, uneasy to trust its own touch. Men went about their duties with an economy of motion, as if each act might unbalance something brittle beneath the order's skin. They polished armor as if polishing could remove memory. They counted names as if counting could anchor meaning. They prayed as if prayer might bind a leaking thing closed. In the quiet that followed the crucible, two truths settled over the brethren like a cold fog. The first, they had survived something that had learned the ledger of their souls. The second, survival had a cost that could not be accounted for on any sheet of vellum. The monastery's surfaces bore the marks, singed sigils. A chapel whose stone still held the faint smell of filaments. A bell tower that had not rung in a century, now silenced by hands that trembled when they touched its rope. Men who had been hardened by war found their hands uncertain when lifting relics. The old confidence, the kind that once made a man's jaw square, now had the pallor of someone who knows pain and smiles because he must. They attempted, through policy and ritual, to make the future legible. New decrees moved through the inner circle, tight and procedural. Relics were reclassified. Access codes became ceremonies. Chaplains were instructed to add measures of confession that doubled as vetting. Tech adepts instituted new sterilization runs, not only for equipment but for the data slate archives, for memory itself. Names that had once been whispered with pity were now categorized and tagged, and where compassion once might have guided a hand, procedure clothed it. It was not the same thing as judgment. It was an attempt to stop the contagion of yearning from moving like a flame through the Order's libraries and wards. Yet the ledger could not wholly contain what had been touched. Men who had been confronted with the lattice, those who had been coaxed with the promise of return or shown their own hidden ledgers in a mirror, left their marks behind. Some marks were physical, faint, script-like scars running along palms and inner wrists. The memory of lullabies hummed under breath. The habit of leaving a piece of a child's toy tucked in a helmet liner. Some were moral. New hesitations in the field, a private softness when standing over a pyre, an unwillingness to strike quickly at a face that might, somewhere, have been a brother's. These things were small, but they accumulated. They changed the tenor of decisions. They altered the cadence of hunts. Not every change was gentle. The Order's methods grew both sterner and more covert. There were purge lists compiled in midnight councils, names blacked out and then burned. There were trials held in rooms lit only by the dim light of sealed lamps, where men's confessions were recorded in voices, so small one had to listen twice. There were punishments delivered the way winters are delivered, all at once, and then silence for months. Some accused were executed by slow, surgical means that left no spectacle and left survivors with the kind of silence that is a knuckle at the throat. Others were given what some called a mercy worse than death, bound to devices, returned to the monastery as walking reliquaries, so that their bodies might whisper warnings by their very posture. Yet within the hardening, there were also subterranean acts of defiance. Men hid names in lining seams. A captain tucked a scrap of cloth with a child's drawing inside his breastplate and would press it to his face in the dark. A tech adept learned to jam a sensor just long enough for a repentant fallen to be moved in secret. Elian, with the filament tied in his coat, did not volunteer his talisman. He let it be a small, private proof that not everything of value could be logged. These acts were not merely small rebellions against the inner circle. They were attempts to preserve the fragments of humanity the lattice had shown them could be reclaimed, if imperfectly and at cost. The monastery's liturgy altered in subtle ways. Chaplains, who had once preached the purity of purpose without indulgence, began to read from texts that acknowledged the weight of grief. Hymns acquired a minor key. Prayers asked not only for victory but for memory kept in mercy. There were debates, long and bitter, about whether the change was wise. To some, any softening was a breach that would let the infection in deeper. To others, a hardness that could not be softened would be as ruinous as the lure of the filaments. The debate was never resolved. It became another ledger entry to be consulted when nights were long and decisions were lonely. Outside the walls, whispers traveled with the winds of warp-scarred space. Word of the lattice and of the failed miracles, of the filigreed menace that could coax grief into a weapon, filtered into intelligence reports, into the ears of rivals and allies. Some suggested that the dark angels had been touched by a relic from Caliban, old and cunning. Others proposed that the lattice was an emergent thing, a strange intelligence born from grief and alloy and transmission. There were even voices, secret and not to be trusted, that argued the lattice had been a lesson, an engine meant to teach men the cost of memory. None of these answers placated the men in the monastery. They only made the future feel more like a set of variables than a fate. Elian's filament stayed with him as a private liturgy. He came to know its faint pulse like the memory of his wife's hand. At odd hours, he would pull it from his coat and hold it as if holding a child. The filament emitted no sound he could measure, but it vibrated against his thumb with a warmth that suggested life. Sometimes he dreamed of a child running to him, sometimes of his wife calling a name he had not dared to say. When he awoke, tears would gather at the corners of his eyes, and he would press his palm to his chest as if to check that the name remained. Brother Captain Merrick did not keep trinkets. He kept ledger lines. After the vault, he prowled the corridors with an attentiveness sharpened by failure. The change in him was a hardening that bordered on tenderness. He would, without question, bring a fallen to trial and yet hesitate for a half-breath if that fallen's hands held a child's toy. Vale, who had once moved with the absolute certainties of a man forged by command, grew quieter. His hands betrayed him with small, tremulous motions when a ledger was open. Ryan, broken and penitent, returned to the chapel and prayed in ways that suggested both torment and the desire to atone beyond doctrine. Joris's splinter group was integrated back into the order only after long oaths and humiliations. Some of his men never returned to their old zeal. There were consequences that could not be corrected. A handful of men who had been touched by the filaments carried the memory of restored things so vividly that they sought to perform the lattice's work in the world, to mend the broken with their own hands and their own forbidden techniques. In some cases, their attempts succeeded in small, terrible ways. A child's limb reattached by clandestine grafts, a village healed of a wound by a procedure that borrowed from the lattice's geometry. In other cases, the results were grotesque, sutures that held but left something altered forever, eyes sewn on the wrong axis, voices restored only to sing back a wrong hymn. Each act of secret mercy widened the fissure between law and longing. The inner circle watched and recorded and punished where it judged necessary. But even its punishments became evidence of a deeper shift. The order had learned that its instruments, blades, decrees, bans, could not alone secure what it most feared losing. The ledger, once a tool of simple memory, had become a paradoxical altar. To maintain the past was to endanger the living. To purge the past was to deny the truth that men carried with them. The solution was never clean. It wound and rewound itself into the daily life of the Brotherhood. And so life resumed with a new architecture of vigilance. Patrols wore extra seals. Chapels added lines to the vows. Tech priests installed isolation loops. Yet beneath each technical solution was the same human discomfort. The knowledge that ritual could be learned, imitated, and then used against the order as easily as any weapon. To protect themselves, the Dark Angels did something the Lattice might not have expected. They began to teach their children the names they had once hidden. They told stories in slow, careful cadences in which shame was named and contextualized. They taught the next generation that truth, while painful, was part of duty. It was not a cure. It was a small resistance, one that acknowledged memory rather than burying it. This admission of memory had its dangers. Names, once spoken openly, invite inquiry. A small troop of inquisitors might someday hear a rumor and dig. The Order accepted this risk because the alternative, living forever with secrets seething under ceremonial robes, had proven corrosive. Perhaps the Lattice had been correct in one fundamental observation. The ledger could not remain sealed without cost. The price that came from opening it was not consolation so much as responsibility. Time, which had always been the Dark Angel's ally when buried things needed to be forgotten, no longer worked as cleanly. The Lattice had taught them that time alone could not sterilize a memory, that the act of naming was active and continuous. So the Brotherhood changed its practices. It created spaces where grief could be conducted like ritual without the sting of secrets, public mourning, recorded apologies, memorials that did not merely list names but told small true stories. Men were encouraged to confess in public as well as in private, to prevent a whisper from becoming a filament. These reforms were small and halting, full of compromise and argument. They did not please everyone. Some men left. Not many, but enough to matter. A captain who could not reconcile the new nuance with the old oath. A tech adept who believed the lattice should have been allowed to continue its work. A chaplain who thought the soul's purity must always come first. They left quietly, with no banners and no flourish, and the monastery did not chase them. Their departures were another kind of ledger entry, and yet the most persistent sign that the threat had not been wholly excised was not found in policy or in exile, but in the small, unremarked moments. A man waking to the taste of soot and child laughter in his mouth. A chapel candle sputtering though no draft moved. A filigreed smear found under a floorboard and burned in private. Once in a while, a bell would sound 3 slow, too quick, too faint for a newcomer to hear, but enough to make a passerby stop, hand to lip, eyes searching the dark. Each time it happened, men paused and felt the old stirrings in their ribs. Elian, who had spent nights talking to shadows and days cataloging what the lattice had taught him, grew older in ways both visible and invisible. He kept his filament as a secret talisman and as a lesson. He told no one the full details of what he had seen at the mirror. He only said, sometimes, that truth had weight, and that weight had to be borne with gentleness. Those who listened to him found themselves thinking, not necessarily of mercy, but of the tenuousness of all moral certainties. In the end, there was no tidy victory to celebrate. The monastery stood, scarred but intact. Its banners flew where they could be seen, their edges frayed and restitched by hands that trembled with memories. The dark angels continued their watches. They continued, because that is what they had always done. Stand between chaos and the living, keep names, carry duty. But they also carried something else now. The knowledge that their ledger could be read not only by themselves, but by other things. That some instruments of repair might be indistinguishable from snares. That mercy, when given without care, could be a contagion. And in that knowledge, there was a new kind of vigilance. A soft, watchful grief that did not announce itself with trumpets, but moved like a dim light behind closed eyelids. It was not heroic. It was ordinary. It looked like a man leaving a toy in a shrine, like a tech adept humming a lullaby while he repairs a pump, like a chaplain adding a line to a prayer. It was a care small enough to survive in the long, cold bureaucracy of the Imperium. On certain nights, when the stars outside the observation ports are slender and spared the haze of warp, the monastery's guards still hear a pattern in the hull. 3 slow knocks, too quick. They check the hull, they scan the hull, they report nothing. They close their logs and go back to their liturgies. They sleep with their hands at their faces. The ledger remains on the inner circle's table, fuller than it was before the lattice and emptier in other places. It has new practices written into its margins, new prohibitions and new permissions, as if the Brotherhood had learned that the only way to be less vulnerable to seduction was to be more candid about what one guards. The filaments where they are found are burned, shredded, and catalogued, then buried or stored where no one will touch them without oath. Sometimes they are not found at all, small residues that cling to memory and are far harder to excise. And somewhere beyond the compound, in the hollows where the lattice had once sung, something waits with patient intelligence. It had learned the ledger and been taught the value of names. It had been stilled, not killed. The thought of that possibility keeps careful men awake. It suggests a future in which the Watchers have more than patience. They have a plan. So the Order goes on. It polices itself with a fierceness that sometimes becomes compassionate. It teaches its neophytes to name and to tell the truth about what they have been made to carry. It creates small rituals of remembrance and small councils of mercy. It is less certain than it once was, and in that lessened certainty, there is a brittle humility. At the last, the tale closes not with the clean click of a seal, but with an enduring unease. The dark angels learned something they could not easily unlearn. That memory is both a weapon and a wound, that to name is to heal and to harm, that something outside their walls had learned how to speak their language. They learned that survival might demand both brutality and tenderness, and that those two things are often impossible to reconcile. The monastery stands under the indifferent stars. Men who once believed only in iron and in law now keep small candles for the dead. They watch the skies. They count names. They tell stories to one another, not to erase but to keep. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.